Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Batman and Dracula, Red Rain. Insert Peter Gabriel reference here. Now, Red Rain is a graphic novel written by Doug Moench and illustrated by Kelley Jones, and published by DC Comics in 1991 under their Elseworlds imprint. Now, Elseworlds is something that DC Comics does sometimes, where there's stories that feature their well-known characters that are specifically set outside of continuity, and in a lot of cases, writers can do radically different things with the characters, or even kill off well-known characters without it affecting the mainstream canon. For example, there's a Superman Elseworlds story from Mark Millar called Red Sun, which is basically what if Superman landed in Soviet Russia instead of Kansas? There's another Batman Elseworlds story from around the same time as this called Gotham by Gaslight, which is basically what if Batman lived in the 19th century and what if Jack the Ripper came to Gotham. Now, this graphic novel features the character of Batman, originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, going up against Count Dracula, the titular antagonist of the classic 1897 novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, which is probably the most famous vampire novel ever written. It's a story that's constantly been readapted and reinterpreted in the 100+ years since the original novel was written, from movies like Nosferatu to the Todd Browning Dracula with Bela Lugosi to the Hammer Dracula films with Christopher Lee to movies like Fright Night and the Monster Squad to the Francis Ford Coppola adaptation of Dracula with Gary Oldman. Now, I do want to point out that years before this comic, there were technically two Batman and Dracula movies, however, neither of which were authorized by DC. But in 1964, you had a film from Andy Warhol called Batman Dracula, and then there was a 1967 Filipino film called Batman Fights Dracula. However, both of these films are now considered to be lost, but dear God, I would love to find a way to see these movies. Now, I'm doing this review as part of my yearly series of Batman reviews, which is something I've been doing at the beginning of every year since 2013, and it's now 2023, so it's now been 10 years since I've been doing these Batman reviews. Think about that for a second. I was 20 when I first started doing these Batman reviews. I'm 30 now. I've basically wasted a large portion of my 20s on YouTube and Batman. I also already did a review on this book back in 2014 during my second cycle of the Batman reviews. That old review is still up, however it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you can still see it with a link, which I'll leave in the description below. Now, upon rereading this, I will say that this comic is flawed, but it's still an interesting story, and it's an interesting reinterpretation of both the Batman and Dracula mythos, and it is interesting seeing these two legendary characters brought together. So, the plot of Red Rain is a series of grisly murders is plaguing Gotham City, but because most of the victims are either prostitutes or homeless people, the media isn't paying much attention to this, and the politicians are kind of sweeping it under the rug, and the only two people who seem to give a shit are Commissioner Gordon and Batman. But Batman, or Bruce Wayne, is also having dreams of this woman who visits him at night. And eventually Batman learns that these murders are the work of vampires, and it turns out that Dracula himself has come to Gotham City to feed on the city's homeless and to build a vampire army. And it turns out that this woman from Bruce's dreams is real. She's a woman named Tanya who turns out to be a vampire herself who is turned against Dracula. So in the story, Batman, Jim Gordon, Alfred, Tanya, and this small group of good vampires now have to stop Dracula before he unleashes his vampire army upon Gotham. And it turns out that Batman is slowly becoming a vampire himself, and he might have to pay the ultimate price in order to save his city. But yeah, Batman and Dracula is a fun read, but I did have some minor issues with it upon rereading the book. Like, a lot of the characters outside of the characters that we know, like Batman, Jim Gordon, and Alfred, a lot of the other characters came off as very two-dimensional and very flat, in my opinion. Like, Tanya should be an interesting character, but I don't know, there really wasn't much to her character, in my opinion. And even Dracula himself is kind of portrayed as a two-dimensional bad guy in this, and honestly could have been any generic vampire. That being said, I did enjoy this comic quite a bit, and there's also some interesting environmental themes in the story. Like, in the story, blood red rain is raining down on Gotham City, and it turns out this is some kind of ecological event caused by pollution. You also find out in the story that Dracula is slowly going insane because of pollution. And I thought that was interesting. There's also sort of a commentary on how we treat the homeless and class issues by the fact that in the beginning of the comic, nobody's really paying attention to Dracula's homeless victims, and Gotham's mayor is trying to push it under the rug. So again, there are some interesting social themes in the story, or you could just read it as a fun superhero/horror comic. Lastly, I do want to point out Kelley Jones's artwork in this. It's very stylized and also very cartoonish at times, but at times it also really complements the horror as well. And I also really like how Kelley Jones draws Batman. I like how he draws him with sort of the cathedral ears. Like, he makes Batman look very gothic, which fits for this story because this is a tribute to gothic horror stories. Now, Doug Moench and Kelley Jones did 2 sequels to this graphic novel. You had Bloodstorm in 1994 and Crimson Mist in 1999. Now, the 2 sequels are about Batman as a full vampire, and they're about him dealing with his vampirism, and it gets worse as the stories progress. Now, I already reviewed the 2 sequels back in 2016, however, I also marked those as unlisted because I'm planning on redoing those reviews sometime next year when I do these Batman reviews, but if you want to check out my old reviews, I'll leave links to them in the description below. Now, this and the 2 sequels make up the Vampire Batman trilogy, and I actually like the sequels even better than this. And the sequels do a really good job at messing around with the concept of Batman as a vampire. Now, even though these are Elseworld stories, later DC comics that deal with the multiverse concept sort of tied these comics in with the mainstream continuity. They just suggested that these comics were set on a parallel Earth. For example, I think there's a Swamp Thing story where Swamp Thing enters the universe of the Vampire Batman trilogy, and the Vampire Batman also makes a cameo in the Scott Snyder story arc Dark Knight's Metal, where you see alternate universe versions of Batman. Now, in 2005, you had the animated film The Batman vs. Dracula, which was in the same universe as the TV series The Batman. Now, that was not a straight adaptation of Red Rain, but it did take some elements from this graphic novel. So yeah, that was my review of Batman and Dracula Red Rain by Doug Moench, and bye.